Negative K, nothing further, just kitty camping in the corner.
So, I've been a police officer for a small town in Massachusetts for about 10 years. Overall, it's been a stressful but rewarding job. Not because of the pay, but because you know you're doing something right for your community. The town I worked for was a small town called Provincetown, which is one of those towns right on the beach beside the Cape. It has a population of around 3,000 people, and I'd normally never get any calls as the town was known to be one of the safest. The most you'd ever get was the occasional robbery or break-in, but that was about it. However, as the saying goes, you don't know what tomorrow will bring. That quote is the exact definition of what happened one spring. This is one of the creepiest and most unexplainable calls I've ever been on that nearly made my stomach drop. This happened in 2021 of April, where I had been monitoring the roadways when I had gotten a call about hearing screams coming from the beach. This was weird, as I've never gotten a call from the beach. I had figured it was a report that someone had gotten bit by a shark and needed assistance. We get a lot of sharks that come around this time of year and would sometimes have to close off the beaches. Needless to say, I got dispatched over to the area of the beach where I had seen a bunch of beachgoers filming and pointing at something in the water. I get out of my patrol car and walk up to the people watching this thing bobbing around in the water. From my perspective, it looked like a small buoy, but as it got closer, I came to the realization that it was the head of a person. Whoever it was clearly unconscious as the waves pushed this person to shore. The second they did, I was immediately filled with the sense of dread and confusion. It was the body of a man who appeared to be in his early 20s, wearing cargo pants and a leather jacket. There was no blood, no signs of hypothermia, or anything that could hint as to how he died. In fact, it seemed like he'd been dead for, at most, a day or two. I tell everyone to step back while I perform CPR just in case he was alive. However, there was no pulse, and that was when backup had arrived along with a detective. Now this is where shit really starts to get weird. At one point, we had searched his jacket, and in one of the pockets was a small Ziploc bag of some type. Inside was what looked to be a folded piece of paper with letters written on it. Once we unfolded it, we were all baffled by what the context of the page meant. It was all just a bunch of letters and symbols scrambled together on separate lines of the paper. Only then did we realize that what we were looking at was some sort of cipher. It looked like total gibberish to the naked eye, but we knew there were people in the FBI who specialized in cracking codes and riddles. Many of us who were on scene that day believed that whatever the cipher meant could possibly give us a hint as to what actually happened to this man. At that point, we obviously had to close the beach and even enforce a curfew of this section of Provincetown. The body was recovered where an autopsy was later performed. The creepy thing was that the autopsy couldn't identify as to what actually killed him. Eventually, the town ruled his death as being natural causes from the ocean. Not too long after, a lot of crazy rumors started to spread around the town. Some speculated that he had drowned, others believed he was murdered, and there were even some who thought Satanism was to blame. This led many people to believe that there was a serial killer in the town who lived by the beaches. Another theory was mentioned that this incident was somehow connected to the Lady of the Dunes case. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a similar case that occurred in the same town in the 70s. While there was no evidence of the two cases being linked, we couldn't take the risk of a killer nearby, which is why the beaches were closed. As far as I know, The FBI and forensic analysts have yet to decipher this code and what it meant, even with advanced computer programs. It's been a few years now, and this case still haunts me. Every time I think about it, more and more questions pop into my head about what really happened. How did he die? Why did he have an encoded cipher? And what sort of riddle would be uncovered had it been solved? It still freaks me out till this day. I'm a police officer in South Carolina. I've been doing this since I was around 30, and it's been a stressful but also a joyful experience. However, it's not at all an exciting job most people would think it is. I won't disclose the name of the actual town I lived in, but it was one of those towns that wasn't too safe but wasn't too dangerous. I would most of the time be doing the night shifts where the chances of crime slightly increased. Most of the time you'd mainly get calls of people shoplifting and maybe even occasional break-ins every once in a while. I've been on several calls that had to do with both those kinds of things, but for the most part, it wasn't anything life-threatening. Throughout my time as an officer, I've definitely had to deal with stressful situations, but this incident takes the prize. There was this one night where I didn't receive any calls and was just cruising down on the road with no cars and no streetlights. As I'm driving, I then see up ahead these orange reflectors that appeared to be blocking the road in front of me. Beside these reflectors was a parked unmarked car with its headlights turned off. As I got closer, I realized that these reflectors I was seeing were traffic cones. All of a sudden, a man got out of the car and slowly approached me. He looked to be in his early 20s, about 6'1", and wore what appeared to be a police uniform that wasn't part of our town. I got out of my car to ask what was going on, and he had apologized, telling me that I had to go around the other way. In a direct tone, I ask, "What's your name, son?" He replies with Officer Darrell and that he had been assigned to close the road. Right away, I immediately started to have suspicions of him, as even though he was in uniform, it still didn't seem official. What I mean by this is that he didn't have equipment on except for a radio and a gun case. When I confronted him about this, he had claimed that he was under-equipped and that he worked for a county that I've never heard of. This instantly made me suspicious, as there were many red flags in his story. Despite the flashing lights coming from his unmarked vehicle, I knew there was a good chance he was a fake cop. Eventually, I scoffed at him, declared that I was not stupid and to put his hands behind his back. However, he didn't budge and didn't even look scared or guilty. He just stood there, staring in my direction with this blank expression on his face, as if he were doing something mundane, like taking out the trash or raking leaves. Suddenly, I hear what sounds like a twig snap from behind me. I turn around and see this very tall person wearing a white ski mask. In his hand, a fire axe. I instantly draw my gun while screaming, telling him to put the axe down. He doesn't comply, and that's when I hear and see movement coming from around the tree line. I yell out for everyone to come out of the woods with their hands up while still keeping my eye on the guy with the axe. Long story short, about 15 or so people wearing these scary masks emerge out of the woods with their hands up. A few seconds later, the phony cop says to me in a smug tone, "I think you should probably leave." Without hesitation, I get in my car and drive back the way I came while radioing dispatch for backup. I'd say I drove back to the police station so fast that I didn't care what the speed limit was. The station had dispatched several units to the area I was in. However, like in many unfortunate situations, whoever was there disappeared into the woods. We ended up recovering the car, which ended up being stolen from 3 towns over. There was an open investigation that lasted for about a week before it was closed as we couldn't find any more info. I'm still not sure what it was that I encountered that night, but I believe it was an ambush meant to trap unsuspecting victims. Given that I was a police officer, I had somewhat an advantage, which is why they let me go. This just goes to show you as to how hard our jobs can really be. A few months later, a woman and her boyfriend went missing in the exact same area. Their car was found, but they weren't. The news said that they likely got lost as they were walking through the woods, but I've always wondered about that. Before I begin with my story, I want to point out that this is something that some may find disturbing and sad. It isn't so much of a scary story, just one of many incidents not too commonly talked about. That being said, here it goes. This happened in the summer of 2015, back when I was an on-duty police officer. I've been in the police force for several years, and you'd oftentimes have to respond to calls you didn't want to. This ultimately led you to see and hear some disturbing things you couldn't even imagine. I've dealt with many different calls that ranged from abusive exes to full-on crime scenes. However, there was this one call I would never forget, and it was actually the call that made me quit. As I said, it was the summer, and I had just gotten done eating lunch when I received a call from an operator at the station. As the story went on, an 11-year-old sister was home alone with her 3-year-old brother who had reported him missing as she couldn't find him for hours. Now, normally calls with missing children would almost always turn up upon arrival, but that wasn't the case in this situation. Me and my field training officer had arrived to the house where the call was made and had begun searching the house. We went through rooms, checked under beds, in closets, and even outside with our canine. We basically tossed the house upside down, but was unable to find the brother. I'd say after a good hour of searching, my field training officer and I had decided it would be best to wait before gathering a search party. However, that was until I was walking around the backyard when I noticed something strange at the bottom of the pool. As I get closer, I immediately take off my belt and dive into the water to retrieve the kid we had been looking for. I begin to perform CPR while telling the field training officer to call for an EMT. But after a few looks at him, it was already clear that he was deceased. The sister was a mess, which made me start to sob as well, knowing that I couldn't save him in time. For the whole day, we pretty much comforted the sister and her parents to help them get through this. As it turns out, the kid was trying to reach for a pool toy that happened to be in the water. This ultimately resulted in him reaching too far, causing him to fall over into the pool. The crazy part was that he had just started swimming lessons with his parents, which only added to the pain. The following week, I quit my job as a police officer on the spot as I simply couldn't get my mind off of that call. I knew if I were to stay that I'd likely get more calls like that down the road. It was only a matter of time. Calls with kids are the worst, especially if they don't have a happy ending. For God's sake, please don't leave your kids home alone, especially if you know they get easily distracted. I hope you use my story not only as a lesson, but also as a message to understand what police officers go through. We all have this perception of police officers arresting the bad guys and protecting our communities. While all of that is partially true, there are also the calls that are never talked about. That call I responded to is definitely one of them.